Hi guys, GE White here. You can call me Jill. I hope you guys are all doing well during this time of social distancing and self-isolation. I decided that I would take this time to read to you a couple chapters from my upcoming debut novel, Eyes of the Eternal, which will be published with the wonderful people at Dollhouse Publishing in the near future. We don't have a hard date at the moment, but we are aiming for a early summer release, so hopefully in a couple of months or so. Eyes of the Eternal is the first book in a new adult urban fantasy book series, and I'm super excited about it. So it's got diverse characters, LGBT themes, and has a fun new twist on Greek mythology. So those of you out there who are Percy Jackson fans and are looking for something that's a little bit more mature, definitely follow myself and Dollhouse Publishing on social media to get updates of when the book may be released. So with that all being said, all the information on our social media will be in the description down below. And let's get right into the reading. Okay. Prologue. Artis sat in the back of a pub, nursing his gin. He wrinkled his nose as he took in the scent of humans around him, the sound of their pool and dart games as they chatted to one another, while nursing drinks at the bar, or sitting with their eyes closed as they listened to 80s rock pour out of the vintage jukebox. To the other patrons of the Fox and Fife pub, Artis looked like any other human. His true form was hidden behind a barrier of magic, but no illusion could completely conceal his oversized frame. The result was a hulking figure, whose brown hair, cropped closely to his skull, framed two brooding dark eyes, moving quickly as they worked to counteract the glamour, concealing his true facial form. Artis sneered. Why his contact had insisted on meeting in the second realm was beyond him. Not only would he stink of humans by the end of the night, he now had to spend a long night masquerading as one of the vermin. True, many of his kind had made this realm their home. The artist could not understand how they could constantly demean themselves by wearing human forms. Speaking of his kind, his contact should have been there half an hour ago. Argis's chair creaked as he turned to survey the pub. He was rewarded with the sight of his sister-in-arms entering through the wooden doors, followed closely by a dark-haired man. Artis did not recognize him, due in part to the newsboy cap shadowing the man's face. The woman, upon catching sight of Artis, slid up to meet him at the small table in the back of the establishment. She appeared to be in her late 30s or early 40s, and the fates had been kind to her, leaving her ageless face free from scars and other misfortunes. Her dark, shining hair was piled loosely on her head, and a few wayward strands fell down around her dark green eyes to frame her slight Mediterranean features. Her companion trailed behind her. He seemed younger, and appeared as if he were of Asian descent. Tall and lean, no match for Argis's intimidating size, the giant thought smugly. However, the Cyclops grudgingly admitted, as he thought of his own single eye, that appearances could be deceiving. Argis, good to see you, the woman said, her voice easily cutting through the steady murmur of human conversation. You as well, Scarlet, she interrupted. Scarlet, Argis echoed. Is that what you're calling yourself these days? For now. I think it fits, don't you? Scarlet neatly folded herself into the chair opposite the hulking giant. Her silent companion remained standing, his attention focused on the crowd around them. I wouldn't know, seeing as this is the first I've heard from you in over 20 years. Artis gestured to the man behind her. Who's the stooge? A new business partner. He's providing some detailed information on our targets. Artis sniffed. He's not one of us. Another sniff. Not exactly human either. It doesn't matter what he is, Scarlet answered sharply. I'm vouching for him. That should be enough for you and your brothers. Now, I suggest we get on with it before that flimsy glamour of yours wears off and we have a human hysteria on our hands. Artis grunted. He and his brothers may not have been the wisest creatures across the realms, but he knew how to put on a simple human glamour. Fine. So, did you bring it? Scarlet asked, urgency creeping into her voice. Artis pulled a duffel bag from under his chair and dropped it on the table with a loud thud. He unzipped a small section at the top neatly tossed an object to his visitor with a certain grace that contradicted his appearance. Scarlet caught the item with ease and began her inspection. It was a heavy metal cuff bracelet with a watch-like dial and only 2 settings visible. I take it you had no trouble getting the materials? Hephaestus hasn't changed his scrap heap locations in centuries, Argus grinned. He really should keep track of what he throws away. Scarlet nodded, her attention still fixed upon the device in her hand. How many were you able to make? Argus was silent as he opened the rest of the bag, flipping over the top panel as he displayed the metal cuffs. Last I counted, it was somewhere over 60. I trust that will be enough? Scarlet ran her finely manicured nails over the exposed merchandise. This should do for now, though if this plan doesn't work out, I may need a bigger order. Artus's gaze trailed over the woman's face. He knew that look, jaded yet determined. The plan she had described to him over the phone was far from inconsequential. It could change everything. You really want to do this, he said. Just wipe them all out. Do you know what that would do to the gods? Make them obsolete, she answered. That's not all. I know what it would do. The nails that had been caressing the cuffs now dug deeply into the wood of the table. I've been thinking about this for a long time. Ever since the last job we pulled together, she continued. The soul calendria, Argus huffed. I knew going after that magical paperweight was a mistake. What's in it that has you so agitated? That's none of your business. All you need to know is that once this is over, they will be gone, and things will go back to the way that they were. You do realize that the 5th race was here before us, he said. Scarlet shrugged. Fine. Then back to the way things should have been. She focused once more on the bag before her. I take it you and your brothers kept one each? That's a given, Argus replied. A little insurance to make sure you don't move ahead without us. You don't have to worry about that. I still need you. And when you don't need us anymore, he quipped. Scarlet leaned back in her chair to fully observe the giant sitting before her. We are of the same kind, and not many of us exist anymore, she said. Do you honestly think I'd betray you or your brothers? Can't be too careful nowadays. Argus's glamored eyes narrowed as he looked down his nose at the woman before him. No, I suppose you can't. But don't worry. If something does go wrong, I'll look after you, she assured. Scarlet gave a jerk of her head, now gesturing to her silent companion. The slight man lifted Argus's duffel bag and stood at attention, waiting for his mistress's word. Scarlet stood. I'll make sure these get passed over to our other compatriots. I'll contact you and your brothers when I need your services again. Argus nodded his head towards the tavern door, and Scarlet and her companion moved as one towards the exit. Despite her words, he knew she was dangerous. Treachery ran in her blood, as the last man in her life could attest. Or at least the man could have, were he still alive. Scarlet's assistant would be wise to be on his guard. As for Argus, he had his brothers to help watch his back, as he would theirs. Family came first. Scarlet and her partner exited the pub. She hissed as the spitting rain caught her in the eye, prompting her to dig into her purse, find her sunglasses, and slip them onto her face. The man at her side opened a compact umbrella, sheltering them both as they strolled towards the parking lot. You actually trust him? Scarlet's companion asked, finally breaking his silence. I don't trust anyone, Victor. Not even you, she replied. And yet you're willing to work with us. I am. Only Argus and his brothers can build what I need, and so far only you can give me access to where I need to go. Victor's dark eyes trailed over Scarlet's slight form, narrowing as he scrutinized her, studying her motives. You really hate the gods that much? It's not so much about hate as it is about necessity, she answered casually. I've lived much longer than you, and after seeing the gods make the same mistakes over and over, I've realized they don't deserve the curse of mortality. You've known that for a while, and have been content to do nothing. What's changed? Victor asked as they approached his car. He stepped to the passenger side and held the door open. They tried to take my family from me. Scarlet dropped her voice as she sank into the car seat. Victor closed the door behind her and made his way to the other side of the car. Watching the dark-haired man's fluid movement from inside the vehicle, Scarlet choked out a humorless laugh. No one steals from a daimon. Chapter 1. Quinn Smith had never considered himself a criminal mastermind. In fact, he supposed he couldn't be considered a criminal by any stretch of the imagination. The somewhat gangly 18-year-old youth was slight of build, with bright gray eyes. His ash-blonde hair feathered about his face, blinding his vision briefly as his slender fingers, now shaking slightly, forced a paperclip into the front door of the Ashdale Public Library. The library had been closed for hours, its patrons and staff long since departed. If he had been asked to best describe his state of mind as he jostled his paperclip into the tarnished lock, Quinn would be hard-pressed to find the words to articulate the enormity of the compulsion he was feeling. In a way, he couldn't even describe what he was doing there himself. It wasn't as if he had gone out with the intent to break and enter. No, Quinn had just felt restless. He had spent the past few days helping Mr. Reynolds fix up some of the classrooms at the Lakeshore Skills Center. Finishing late, he had simply planned a stroll in the quiet evening hours back to the group home where he lived. But Quinn's walk did nothing to relax him. With each step, he felt more on edge. If he didn't know any better, Quinn would swear he was suffering from withdrawal. He found that reading had always felt like a balm applied to his frenzied mind. So when the young man had seen the sign for the library and remembered the instructional books on the second floor, his growing anxiety had driven him towards the now closed building. His breathing now coming in ragged, sharp hisses, Quinn soon felt the lock beneath his fingers give way with a faint click. The library's front door swung inwards, and as if he was being led along a puppet master's string, Quinn stumbled through the doorframe and across the ancient carpet to the stairs leading up to the second level. He continued up the 2 flights of stairs undeterred, numb to the possibility of any security cameras or silent alarms. Reaching the instructional section, Quinn turned into the first row and pulled several books down at random. Maybe if he were to read them, then this strange compulsion would be satisfied. Collapsing to the floor, now sitting within a ring of hardcover books, Quinn picked up the tome nearest to him and began to read. The book was a manual on home renovation, and he soon became completely immersed in learning about load-bearing walls, feng shui, and the benefits of cork flooring. Quinn read faster than he ever had before, but the information he took in remained with him, despite his quickened pace. The knowledge stayed at him completely, like warm broth might to a starving man. So absorbed was he in his frantic reading, Quinn failed to notice the blue and red flashing lights that shone through the library window several minutes later. A career cop in his mid-40s, Officer Kendry had been surprised to get the dispatch call to check out the local library. Silent alarm had been triggered a few minutes ago, but the books were already free to borrow. A burglar seemed unlikely. Maybe a couple of kids had broken in to vandalize the place for kicks. Kendry had asked his younger partner, Officer Fields, to wait outside should anyone try to slip past him. She nodded, content to stay by the patrol car. The police officer entered the library silently, noting that the lock had not been jimmied open, but picked, if the unfolded paperclip jammed in the keyhole was any indication. "Police, show yourself," he called, his gun and flashlight drawn. Hearing the rustling of pages and a faint voice murmuring from upstairs, Kendry ascended, the worn wood stairs creaking and groaning with every step he took. He noted that the noise did not seem to alert the intruder. As he reached the top of the second-story landing, Kendry could see a young man sitting on the floor, dozens of books scattered around him. The boy's lips moved slightly as he muttered softly to himself. Stepping onto the landing, Kendry swung his flashlight over the intruder. The young man in front of him did not stir from his position on the floor between the large bookcase and the railing. "Hey, kid," the officer called. "What are you doing?" Receiving no reply, Kendry cautiously approached the frantic-looking young man. Discerning that the boy was no immediate threat, he holstered his weapon, watching the teen flip through the book's pages at an alarming speed. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked the boy, his voice softening as he stepped closer. Met still by silence, Kendry placed a hand on the reader's shoulder. Intently focused on the words in front of him, Quinn did not hear the officer speaking to him. With the large book in hand, the hyper-focused young man felt as if he were tightly wrapped in a cocoon of knowledge and safety, one that the outside world could barely touch. When Kendry touched his shoulder, the teen jerked back into reality with an unsettling jolt. Suddenly disoriented and quickly becoming terrified, Quinn glanced up to see a shadowed figure looming over him. His reaction was instinctive. He threw out his arm, large book clasped still in his hand, as he attempted to fend off the threatening presence. Surprised by the combination of the fearful cry and powerful shove, Quinn's assailant stumbled back onto the old railing. The brittle wood split with a loud crack, giving way under Kendry's weight as he crashed to the lower level. The sound of flesh hitting tile fully woke Quinn from the remnants of his trance. He blinked away the fog from his mind and lowered his arms, realizing that whatever had hovered over him was gone. Unsettled by the sight of the missing guardrail, Quinn crawled to the edge and peered over the landing. A uniformed police officer lay flat on his back, his head lolling back and forth with pieces of guardrail trapped underneath him. Quinn stared in horror, unable to look away or even move. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. As the police officer flailed on his back, Quinn watched as the fallen officer's partner, drawn by the sound of the crash, entered the building moments later. She stopped short upon seeing Kendry, raising her flashlight and gun to the floor above, pointing them both at Quinn, who blinked owlishly in the sudden light. "You! Hands where I can see them," she ordered. Stunned, Quinn complied as he raised his hands in a submissive gesture. Keeping her eye on the frozen young man, Officer Fields raised her two-way radio to her lips. "Dispatch, this is Patrol Officer 3185 at Ashdale Public Library, requesting backup in an emergency bus. I have an officer down." The rest of her words blurred together in Quinn's racing brain as he gazed down at the fallen man. How had the night come to this? Chapter 2. Sebastian Azeri waited with a feeling of ill ease. The sketch he had been working on lay forgotten in his lap, along with his pencil, as he listened to the gentle patter of rain against the window. He wished he knew what time it was. Raising a tanned hand, he brushed some of his wavy brown hair away from his cloudy golden eyes, more so out of habit than any obstruction to his sight, which he had lost many years ago. Sebastian stood, placing the sketch on the end table to his right, and approached the floor-to-ceiling windows. 20 stories underneath his vigil, the citizens of his city stumbled through their lives like newborn fawns, rising to their feet for the first time, searching for some stability. He knew them, all of them, who they were, where they'd been, and where they were going. He knew them from birth, and would until their death. Even gifted with this knowledge, he was still troubled by the hush of his apartment and the feeling of helplessness that clouded it now. It was a cold, wet March day in Toronto, Ontario. The air had been heavy and damp since late February, and today was one of the sparse days when the clouds saw fit to release their tears onto the city below. The busy streets seemed even more congested, with hundreds of umbrellas carried by the hurried crowds. Sebastian marveled at how business went on as usual. Appointments were made and broken, luncheons were held, money was exchanged for goods and services, some legal, others less so. And high above the city streets during all this chaos, tucked safely away in his penthouse apartment, he was still solely awaiting his companion's return. Suddenly Sebastian heard cursing, muffled as someone struggled to unlock his door. He tensed, the small hairs on the back of his neck prickling as he waited to confront whoever fought with the lock on the opposite side. The door flew open, slamming it against the interior wall. Sebastian heard a sound of muffled irritation before a familiar voice muttered, "Who the hell drives a car in this city?" Sebastian let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. He should have known it was her. He always knew. So what had changed? "Commuters," Sebastian said, answering his visitor's question. "But I'm guessing that's not what you meant," he continued, his Spanish drawl creeping into his voice. While it was true that Sebastian was blind, he also happened to be the physical reincarnation of the Morai, more commonly known as the Fates. Every sentient creature possessed a thread of fate within them, and this thread contained the circumstances of their origin, the time span of their life, and their inevitable death. As the plural fates bound within a single being, Sebastian was the spinner, measurer, and harvester of the threads of fate. He did not create life, but guided it towards its path. and he was there when the lives he had overseen since birth had their threads severed and their life ended. Sebastian's power over the threads of fate was part of him, a kind of symbiotic relationship. Thus, he did still possess a certain sight, beyond his ability to see the past and future. While he would never see the luminescence of a person's skin or the color of their eyes, Sebastian's eyes sharply regarded threads contained within each living being. If someone stood before Sebastian, he could see their threads, twisted and coiled into a vague outline of a body in front of him. Each thread was a unique combination of color, length, and brightness, and helped Sebastian to identify just who or what was in the room with him at any given time. For example, the woman now standing in front of him possessed a deep teal-colored thread that gave off a soft silvery glow as it illuminated her tall, athletic frame. Serena Mallet clucked her tongue irritably. Traffic jams stalled the streetcar for over 30 minutes. I decided to walk the last 5 blocks. Obviously, that was a mistake. Sebastian could hear water dribble on the floor as she wrung the excessive rainwater from her soaked, dark hair to illustrate her point. While Sebastian had never been able to see Serena's features, he had received information from her with which he often imagined her appearance. Early in the days of her duties to him, she had allowed him to trace his hands over her face as he followed the lines of her Grecian nose and heart-shaped jaw. Her athletic build was only a couple inches shorter than his own 5'11" frame. Serena had also done him the courtesy of filling in his unspoken questions before he even thought to ask them. Her long, wavy hair, which she left loose and parted to the side, was dark brown, bordering on black. Her skin was also lightly tanned, though hers was due to her Pashtun heritage on her father's side, while Sebastian's own similar skin tone originated from his Hispanic roots. Serena had once said that her eyes were a dark hazel green, but few people could claim to have seen them, thanks to the dark sunglasses constantly shielding her eyes. "I warned you to take an umbrella, Serena," Sebastian replied, as he heard Serena kick off her boots. He turned to face her, tracking the wire-like frame of her threads as she entered the alcove kitchen, dropping the bags of groceries on her arms onto the countertop. She moved over to the bathroom to snatch a towel and began to dry her hair. It was sunny this morning, she reasoned, leaning in on the bathroom door frame, and the forecast was clear, so why would I listen to you? "Of course, Serena. I mean, what could I possibly know about the weather forecast?" Sebastian asked with a sigh, while tucking a piece of his hair behind his ear. "Mind toning down the sarcasm just a tad?" she retorted. "Besides, aren't you the one who always says that knowing changes nothing? I used to say that, though over the years, some people, and I'm not naming names, have caused me to reconsider my way of thinking." "Oh, really?" Sabrina scoffed as she threw the now damp towel onto the bathroom counter. "See, knowing doesn't change anything, it changes little." "That's nice to know." Serena's tone suggested it was anything but. Sebastian smiled. "Did you bring what I asked for?" Serena let out an irritated sigh and returned to the kitchen. Pulling something from the grocery bag, she dropped it onto the countertop. "Valencia oranges, just as you requested," she said. "Please tell me you're making your madre's orange cake. It's the least you could do for sending me out in the rain." Her words caused a warmth to bloom in Sebastian's chest. Despite the fact that Sebastian was technically Serena's employer, he couldn't help but worry at the thought of just how much he relied upon her. During their time together, they had developed a teasing, complex friendship, yet Serena had never once made him feel like an invalid. While she would often mock his predictions with skepticism, she marveled at and even tried to exploit Sebastian's talent for art, cooking, and baking. Never once did she question his abilities or try to baby him. "It was supposed to be a surprise," he grumbled good-naturedly as he approached and opened the fridge with a practiced precision, retrieving a can of iced tea from the door. "And it was supposed to be sunny today, but here we are. You know, I've been looking after you for how many years now?" Sebastian pursed his lips in thought. "About 4? "It's already been that long?" "Ever since you left the temple." "I didn't realize I was getting so old," Serena huffed dramatically. Sebastian rolled his eyes. "Hey, I'm only a couple years younger than you, and I'm definitely not old, so neither of you. 30 isn't ancient. Maybe not for your kind. But for someone who only gets one ride on this rotating ball of dirt, 30 isn't young. Anyway, you're getting off topic. I was saying I've been looking after you for 4 years now. When I signed up for this gig, I was under the impression that I was to be your bodyguard, not your errand girl. Sebastian winced. This was technically true. Sebastian hadn't hired Serena directly. The woman had been assigned to him. Her main job had been to keep him safe. Not all beings in the three realms were pleased with how the gods governed things. And Serena's main job had been to keep him safe. Luckily, very few threats had surfaced in the time she worked for him. As time passed, her job skewed more towards errands and companionship, with less active vigilance over his safety. Keeping me well-fed is essential to keeping me alive, so technically you are doing your job, Sebastian reasoned. The other gods and goddesses wouldn't want me to starve, he added wearily. Valencia oranges are a luxury, not a necessity. I'm starting to feel like a husband going out to satisfy my pregnant wife's food cravings. This body doesn't have the luxury of becoming pregnant, but it does come with its own benefits, Sebastian gestured to his sightless eyes. I never have to look at Leo's dumb face for one. You've never seen his face before, Serena said. Doesn't matter, I know it's dumb. I'm going to tell him you said that. Sebastian gave an amused snort at Serena's non-threat, turning once more towards the window. He could feel the warmth of the sun coming through the glass as it broke through the clouds. The welcome heat did little to lighten his mood, however, with the information he received that morning clouding his thoughts. Sebastian could tell that what he had heard was just the beginning of what could become a much bigger problem if events were simply allowed to play out without interference. He was hesitant to bring it up to Serena, but then again she would be the best to deal with the news he had to share. That is, if she could hold her temper. Something wrong? Sebastian started as Serena's question pulled him away from his musings. I was joking about the errand girl stuff. Really, I don't mind. It's not that, he said, cutting her off. Then what? Serena took a step towards him. The earthen temple. Sebastian trailed off. He'd been debating whether to tell her about the situation, given her history with the three celestial temples. But the mere mention of one of them was enough to pique her interest. What about it? Someone broke in. That's impossible, she said, her voice tight with anger and righteous certainty. Obviously not. Sebastian swallowed on a dry throat, feeling suddenly uncertain of telling his companion what she least wanted to hear. He decided it was unavoidable. Thuban was stolen. The nearby couch creaked as Serena sank onto its arm. Sebastian knew that his information must be a hard pill for her to swallow. A theft at any of the temples was a serious matter, and the importance of the artifact that had been stolen made it worse. It had to be an inside job, she said. I agree, but you know as well as I do, that means that the other temples are suspect too. Sebastian could practically hear Serena's frown. Thuban was part of a valuable and powerful artifact, one of 3 pieces guarded by the celestial temples. Should all the pieces be collected and the artifact reforged, they would all be in serious trouble. She ran a hand restlessly through her dark waves. So what's going to happen? No lo sé, Sebastian shook his head as he slipped into his native tongue. You don't know? She exclaimed, jumping to her feet and marching to where he stood, hunched and pensive by the window. You see the past, present, and future, and you don't know? The future isn't absolute, he countered. Serena sighed heavily. Sebastian imagined her rubbing at her brow as it furrowed with tension. Count me out. Pardon? Sebastian was taken aback by her words. He had assumed that once she had learned of the Celestial Temple's connection to Thuban's disappearance, she wouldn't be able to resist the mystery. I know what you're thinking, and no. Have someone else look into it. I've got my hands full as it stands now, just looking after you. But you know them. You've worked with the temples before. Sebastian felt as if he was proverbially trying to wrangle an angry cat into a tiny carrier. Yes, but we didn't exactly part on good terms, if you remember. How could he forget? It was true Serena's history with the Celestial Temples was complicated at best, but she was the only one Sebastian trusted who had the inside knowledge they would need to flesh out the thief. It's been a long time since your difficulties, he assured her. Serena scoffed. 4 years. 4 years, and the Zodiac Council still haven't elected new members to the House of Gemini. It's considered cursed. I think they remember. As much as he tried to understand her misgivings, Sebastian couldn't help the flood of frustration that washed over him at her stubbornness. Fine. Fine? Serena's voice escalated as she asked the question. Her tone colored with surprise that the young man had given up so easily. Yes, fine. Sebastian turned from the window and crossed over to the chair he had originally occupied. He gently picked up the sketch he had been working on. No pleading, no mind games, no pulling rank, she pouted. If you won't do it, I'll just have you find me someone who will. Spinning on his heel, Sebastian thrust the sketchbook into Serena's hands before storming to his bedroom and slamming the door behind him. The reverberations of the slammed door caused Serena to wince. Perhaps she was being unreasonable, but the thought of returning to the solar, earthen, and lunar temples made her gut clench with anxiety. It seemed likely that the temples wouldn't even allow her to conduct the necessary investigation in the first place. Serena also couldn't help but wonder who Sebastian had in mind to take her place. She glanced down at the picture in her hand, which seemed as detailed as a photograph. It showed a blond teenage boy with frightened gray eyes walking down the steps of a courthouse. A chubby, balding man stood beside him, seemingly guiding the young man through a sea of reporters that crowded him. "What's this supposed to be?" she called off after him. But only silence, not Sebastian, responded. As Sebastian entered his study, the subject of his latest drawing weighed heavily on his mind. As of late, his visions had revolved around the young blond man, and Sebastian knew that there could be no coincidence that he was thinking of the boy, not with the timing of Thuban's theft. The two were connected somehow. The threads of fate within him hummed with a feeling of familiarity that he could not ignore. This boy was one of them. Ever since the soul calendria had been stolen almost 30 years ago, tracking down the newest incarnations of the gods had been difficult, to say the least. The awakened gods were dwindling. If he and the other gods didn't find them soon, by the time the present generation of gods passed on, all would be forgotten. Sebastian couldn't let that happen. Crossing the study to his bookshelf, Sebastian reached up to the third shelf and felt until his hands encountered what he was looking for. The smooth, hard metal of the ancient helmet was in shockingly good condition, despite having been used in the Imjin War of the late 1500s. The helmet was one of many artifacts his own various incarnations had collected over the centuries. Each item had, at some point, belonged to one of the dozens of gods who worked their magic throughout history. While many of the items, a book from India, a necklace from Sudan, a doll from the French Revolution, belonged to gods who were not currently accounted for, it was the helmet that seemed to call to Sebastian the most. Granted, it had been passed between several gods, but only one was its true owner. Plucking the helmet off the shelf, Sebastian set it on his desk. He couldn't shake the feeling that the god this relic once belonged to was the boy in his vision. And if the theft of Thuban was a sign of things to come, they certainly would need him. So, I hope you guys enjoyed that little sneak peek at my book, Eyes of the Eternal. Once again, if you are interested in possibly reading the rest of this book when it comes out, please follow myself and Dollhouse Publishing on social media, and you can find all the relevant information on our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all that good stuff in the description down below. So thanks again for listening to this, and I hope you have a good rest of the week. All right, bye.